right. Hey, everybody. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute. I'm going to let some people join and we'll get started. And if you're joining, feel free to put something in the chat. You can talk about where you're from, what you're excited about learning, or if there's, just something you're excited about with the Watercolor Snacks box, feel free to do so. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and jump in and get started. I'm going to start things off by introducing myself. My name's Amelia. I am the Watercolor Snacks resident artist, and you'll see me posting videos and tutorials and all kinds of fun things in the mix group and on our Instagram. But I'm really excited to be joining you again for another live stream session. For those of you who have joined Mix and have been checking out Mix and keeping up with that, I did share a little preliminary video going over the box and what all is in there. So you're welcome to check that out. If you did not get a chance to check it out, no worries. I've got my little Watercolor Snacks brochure here. This menu comes in your box, so you can definitely take a look at this and just kind of review everything in here. But everything's pretty straightforward. We've got our materials, and I'll just do a quick intro to those before we get started. So what you'll need is you'll want to have your Watercolor Snacks box materials, everything that came in the box. I do have a couple extra things, so if you need to grab them, you can do that. Some kind of palette. You're going to want something to mix your colors in, but no stress if you don't have one. I like to have one that's a little bigger so I have more room, but like I said, if you don't have one, the cool thing is that there is a palette inside of your watercolor set. So you have something to mix your paints on, whether you have a separate palette or not. Also, bonus, since I have this open, there is actually an extra brush that came in the kit. It looks a little funny because it looks like it has a broken end, but this is just part of the design. And you just pull the top part of the brush out and then put it into the handle like that, and you've got a bonus brush, which I think is pretty cool. And the nice thing is that when you're done with it, you can put your brush back inside of the handle. We were thinking that maybe the hole in the end is so that your brush can dry out, so that it doesn't trap moisture in there and get moldy or anything like that. So got good airflow so it can dry out, and then you can store it back in here. So you're welcome to use that brush tonight as well. I'm just going to keep mine in my palette because I've got my other brushes handy, but bonus brush if you need one. And then a couple other things, not necessary if you don't have them with you, no big deal. But I have a little spray bottle. This came in the last Watercolor Snacks box. They're super handy. Sometimes I use them just to spray down my palette, which is what I'll be using it for, just to get my paints moisturized wet so that I can get them started without having to add big puddles of water. You guys know what I mean. So add that. But if you don't have that, don't worry. You can use just a paintbrush and water, dip your paintbrush into your water, and then you can activate your paints that way too. So I'll show you both ways. And another cool thing that I usually have handy is this is called a pipette, kind of like you've ever done a science experiment, but sometimes I'll use this to put water into my palette for mixing. Again, if you don't have one, you can do the exact same thing with a brush. Just pull water from your cup with your brush into your palette. And then I've got a pencil and a ruler because we're going to do some light sketching. So I have that handy just so I can use that. And if you don't have one, feel free to grab something. If you don't have a ruler, you can just use the edge of a piece of paper or something, just whatever you have. And then I always have paper towel handy so that I can clean off my brush and You know, if I need to dry something off or wipe off my paper or anything like that, I've got that handy. Oh, last thing, 2 cups of water. I usually like to have two, one for cleaning my brush and then one so that I have clean water to mix my paints with. So that's just a really quick intro to the materials that I have. So feel free to grab whatever you need if you don't have it. But I think I'm going to go ahead and just jump in and get started with our lesson for today. All right, so let me rearrange my stuff a little bit. I'm going to show you guys. So the first thing that we're going to be working on is a color mixing chart so that we can start mixing up our colors and figuring out, what we'll be using to create our beach scene. So you'll just need a piece of paper. I just grabbed one from the palette, or not the palette, the paper pad that came in the box. So you can grab that. I divided mine in half so that I could practice on one side and then I'll demonstrate on this side. So you don't need to divide it in half if you don't want to, but you can certainly use the whole page or however you want to structure it is totally fine. And then the painting we're going to be working on is this pretty simple 1-point perspective beach scene. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do a perspective drawing / painting. And we'll go over that once we get to the stage of setting up our drawing. But let's start with mixing our colors. So let me rearrange a little bit here. I'm going to set aside my paper. So that's out of the way. This here. Okay. So I wrote down the colors that I'm going to be using. If you're not sure what color is which, the cool thing about these little pans is that it's written on the side. It's kind of small, so it might be a little difficult to read, but if you look close, you'll see that it'll tell you the color. So this one is turquoise. Another nice thing is you can arrange your colors in any way you want. I actually rearranged mine in a way that so that I had all my warm colors, then they faded into cool colors. So you can arrange them any way that you like. And then I've got my white and Payne's gray up at the top because that's kind of like my black and white. So I just moved them around so that they made sense to me. So now I'm going to spray my palette just to get the paints activated. That was the word I was trying to think of earlier. And so that way now I get my brush wet and I can start laying out the colors in my palette. So if you have a pipette or something like that, just handy thing you can do is just add a little water into all of your palettes or your palette wells. That way you can dilute your paints a little more quickly. You don't have to, keep dipping your brush in and putting it into the palette. But again, if that's what you have, that works totally fine. So there's nothing wrong with that. So I'm going to start by just measuring out a little bit of the colors from my palette. If you're working with this smaller palette, you maybe want to reserve a couple colors at the top and then leave yourself some room for mixing colors. So maybe start with one color mixture at a time, and then you might need to wipe out your wells and start over, just to give yourself the space to mix your colors. So I'm going to grab some of this indigo. And since I already have water in my palette, it is mixing nicely over here. And then the next color I'm going to use is Payne's Gray. So I'll put some in here. And let's start with that first mixture. So I labeled everything, and I think if you're creating a piece with a particular palette and different mixtures of color, this is a really great exercise so that you have a reference for yourself to know what colors you use to mix the different colors in your palette that aren't just pre-mixed as a one of the pans in your palette. It's really helpful because then you can, look back on that. If your palette dries out or you run out of a color and then you come back to it later, or you want to use the same palette, you'll know what colors you mix together. And if you want to get really specific, you can also write the percentages of how much of each color you used. So if, for example, in this mixture of indigo and Payne's Gray, I used 60% indigo and 40% Payne's Gray, I might want to remember that so that I know exactly what I used to mix. Oh, I just realized this is not indigo. This is turquoise. See, I'm telling you guys to read the side, and I didn't even read the side. But that's okay. We'll just start with the second row. We can recover from this. So we'll start with. I was like, this doesn't look the same. Why does this look different? So we'll start with the turquoise, and then we'll get back on track with the rest of them here. So we've got turquoise, and then we'll grab some permanent lemon yellow. Okay, so that's our first mixture here. And there's no particular order to this, so however you end up making your key is totally fine. It doesn't have to be any particular way. So something you might want to think about too, I mentioned about putting the percentages, paying attention to how much of each color you use, especially if you're mixing cool and warm colors. So I have this balance of this cool turquoise and warm lemon yellow. So depending on how much of each color I add, I'm going to end up with a warmer or cooler green. So right now, this is pretty warm. So what you could do if you wanted to get really specific is you could write down, this is more yellow than blue. And then you can make, if I want this to be a cooler green, you just keep adding more blue. So you could do multiple mixtures and then write down a note for yourself of how much of each color you used. I'm going to bring my camera in just a little bit so that you can see that a little more clearly. So part of what I have the pencil for is you can write down turquoise, not indigo. And then I just put a P for permanent, lemon yellow. Cools. So this is warm green and cool green. So you can see just from mixing a couple of colors, particularly a warm-cool combination, you can really get a nice range of color. So you're not super limited with the colors that you have. They actually can go quite far, and you can get a lot of variety out of your color mixtures. And it also just kind of depends on sort of, if you're thinking about a particular mood that can be affected by using warm or cool colors, you might want to work with a warmer palette or cooler palette. The other cool thing about using warm and cool colors in a palette is you can use them as a way to create a focal point. So if you have an all cool palette with a warm focus or focal point, that really helps it to stand out. Okay, so now we will add our indigo, which was right next to the turquoise, to be fair. So now we'll do our mixture of indigo and Payne's Gray. So indigo, Payne's Gray. Now you'll notice indigo and Payne's Gray are also kind of like a slightly warmer, slightly cooler blue color. So Payne's Gray is a cool gray. You can see that it kind of almost looks like a really dark blue. And it's great for when you're mixing colors if you want to make something darker, particularly with a cool palette like all of these greens and blues. It works really nicely to make your colors darker. But I will say that if you're mixing with a warm color, it's going to have an effect because, again, it's on the cooler side of gray. So just be prepared for that, that it might affect your overall temperature of your color. I think this could use a little more. There, so you see, mixing those together, you get kind of a nice in-between color where it's a little darker than turquoise. I keep doing that. It's a little darker than indigo, but it's not quite as dark and gray as the Payne's gray. So indigo, Payne's gray. There we go. All right, so we'll come back to our turquoise here. And now we're going to mix it with this Indian yellow. So the Indian yellow, you can see, is actually a warm yellow, and our permanent lemon yellow is a cool yellow. So we've got two different yellows. They really look different. And again, even colors that fall into a category of warm or cool can have a temperature shift. And that, again, affects how you mix colors. So thinking about color temperature can really help you when you're making decisions about what colors you want to use to create different color combinations, color mixes. So, if you want a particular mixture of color that is a warmer or cooler green, you might choose to work with Indian yellow or permanent lemon yellow. That may affect how you make that decision. And I'll show you the outcome of this compared to our other mixture. So we've got the Indian yellow. And our green is a lot more of a warm, kind of almost spring green type color. And like I did with this other green, I'll add more blue just to make it, to push it to be cooler. But you can see still, even with more blue added, it's still a different green overall. So you've got different types of greens that you can mix with your different yellows. We have the same blue, different yellow. And now we'll switch to another yellow-blue combination with indigo and Indian yellow. So again, we'll take, I have to remember which one's which. This is the indigo here. And Indian yellow. And if you're running out of room in your palette, you might just need to take out color. So I'll just take this one out and give myself some room. And if you feel like the paint that you're pulling from your palette is not strong enough, you can always pull directly from the pan. Just know that you'll end up with a more intense paint mixture, so you might have to water it down if it's too dark. Okay, so now we have another green, darker green. It's a little bit more of like almost a forest green, moss green. And we can push it cooler with more. So even if I add more blue, you can end up with some really kind of like dark, stormy greens. And if you think about it, when you go to the ocean, or if you look at pictures of the ocean, the way that light passes through the waves, some areas are this really kind of light, almost green-blue color. But then areas where it's more in shadow, getting less light, sometimes it looks really stormy and murky, dark colors. Or you think about sometimes there's seaweed in the water, that kind of thing. So it's not always like a bright, clear blue. Sometimes there's a lot of variety in the colors, which is why we're practicing mixing some different colors to give, some energy, some different layers of colors that we can add. So I'm just going to label these really quick. Turquoise, and this is the yellow. We've got our two greens, and then this is indigo and indigo. Got our two greens there. All right, and the last mixture that I thought would be helpful is to mix yellow ochre and burnt sienna. And this is for our sand that we have. So I'm going to rotate this, and I'm going to take out my yellows from here and make some room for, let me take out this green too. Make some room for the sand colors. So I'm going to check to make sure. So this is yellow ochre. So I'll take some of this. Mix a little bit of that in this well too. Oops, sorry. I'm a little too enthusiastic. That. Okay, mix a little more yellow. And then this is, let me make sure, confirm that this is the burnt sienna. Yes, can confirm. Burnt sienna. And we'll mix those together. So again, thinking about a range of values from light and dark, it's nice to have a variety of warm and cool. So something that's going to elevate a painting and help it to feel like it has depth and it's not flat is to have a strong range of values, which is light and dark. Sometimes that can be tricky when you're using color, because again, there's so many factors that come into play with color, things like color temperature, color value, and then, the different mixtures of colors that you can get. And usually one color in a set is not always like the color that you need to mix a certain outcome. So for example, we've got two different types of yellow. So there's so much variety, but I think as long as you have a nice range of light and dark, that can be really helpful when you're creating color mixtures and you're creating an overall painting. That's kind of one of the secrets to making art that doesn't feel flat. Even if you're using a particular style, even if you're using a flat style, having a good range of light and dark will make a big difference in your overall design for your painting or drawing or whatever it is you're working on. So that's our yellow ochre and burnt sienna. Okay, so now we have a nice range of values. You saw that I had to eliminate some of the colors that I mixed just because I didn't have space in my palette for them. But because I have a key, I know that if I want to mix a certain color and I don't have it in my palette, I know exactly what I use to create that color. And then if I need to clear out a color to mix it and then mix that other color again, I've got it, and I have a nice reference for myself. And again, if I want to do this palette again, now I have a key. You can hang it up on your wall, you can put it in a sketchbook, whatever you need, you have it handy. So now that we have our color mixing chart ready to go, if you're still working on it, that's okay. Take your time, keep playing with mixing colors. But now you kind of know what I'm working with and what I'm thinking about when I'm mixing and using the colors in my palette, so you can feel prepared and like you can follow along and know what I'm doing. So I'm going to zoom back out a little bit. So I'm going to lift my camera back up, just give us a little more space while I rearrange a little and set this color mixing chart aside. So I have that handy over in the corner. You can see it peeking out over here. And I'm going to move on to show you our next stage for starting our final painting. So let me just move this out of the way a little bit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one-point perspective. So something that is really helpful, again, with creating depth in a painting and helping things not feel so flat, is to use perspective. There's a couple different ways that you can use it. One is the actual like vanishing point, and these are called orthogonal lines. These are the lines that go back into the distance to that vanishing point. There's also something called atmospheric perspective, and that is when things are sharper in the foreground, and they're typically darker in the foreground, and in the background they get lighter, fuzzier. It's almost misty looking, and it's also way less clear, so you're not seeing as many details. And it kind of looks like it's disappearing out into the distance. That is a really good way to make something look like it's creating a sense of depth, and like it's disappearing into the beyond, like you're looking out into a 3D space. So for the most part, this is actually kind of all close in value, but I think it's helpful to have that vanishing point. And then I'm also thinking about things like, the water might be more foamy up here at the top. And then I created an area where the water had lapped up and had gotten the sand wet, so it was darker. So a couple of things to think about in here. So let's start by giving ourselves some sketch lines to get started. So I'll show you how I set up this painting. So just with a piece of paper from the sketch block here, you kind of want to decide first where your vanishing point is going to be. So I picked something that was back here in this corner, but if you want to totally flip things around, you can do things on the other side. If you don't want it to be quite so severe, you can kind of have more of the beach scene. So you can really make this your own, but you're also totally welcome to just follow along step by step and do the exact same thing that I do. So there's another thing you want to think about, and your vanishing point is going to fall on something called your horizon line. So that's essentially where, if you were watching the sunset, behind the horizon is kind of that line that the sun would go back behind. So I picked, kind of off to the right a little bit. So I'm going to do something similar. And you can start with just a dot. It's so tiny you guys can't even see it, but I just put a little tiny dot, and that is going to be my guideline for where my vanishing point is going to go. And then I am just going to do a really light line. Don't use a heavy hand because you don't really want these lines to show. These are just to help you know where things are going to go. So really lightly, just draw a line across. If it's not lined up with your dot, don't panic. Just erase your dot and move it to fit your line. If it's slightly off, it's not the end of the world. It's not an exact science. At least that's how I feel. Some people may feel differently. I don't know, but I'm a little more laid back with how that all works. And then, so a key thing with perspective is that this vanishing point is important because all of your orthogonal lines, those diagonal lines that guide where your eye goes, are going to come from that point. The exception being anything that is vertical, up and down, is always going to be vertical, and anything horizontal, from side to side, is always going to be horizontal. But any angles are going to connect to your vanishing point. So you want to decide kind of where the line of your water is going to be, and just put a very light line. And then you can see here I have a couple of lines going into the vanishing point. I have a line where the sand goes from being wet sand to dry sand. So you want to pick where that line is going to go. And then I made about 1, 2, 3, 4 sections where there are waves kind of rolling in from the distance. And then an area where it's more foamy and thinner, more shallow than the rest of the ocean. So I would say there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we'll do 5 lines to kind of figure out where all of our waves will be. So this is going to be my dry sand, my wet sand, and then if your ruler's not long enough, that's okay. You can just continue the line. Or it doesn't even have to connect all the way. Let's see. We'll do, I think I'll divide this one in half. It doesn't have to be so wide. Okay, so you can see I've got my lines disappearing back into my vanishing point. So now what I'm going to do, because these lines are not straight, these are kind of squiggly organic shapes, I'm just going to very lightly draw a line that is kind of wiggly. And it's going above and below my orthogonal line that's coming from my vanishing point. Now this can stay flat because this is the horizon where the top of the water meets the sky. So you don't have to add anything, but you can add waves in here when you're painting. So it doesn't have to be completely still from that side, but you'll want it to be mostly even and flat. One thing I forgot to mention that you might want to grab is just an eraser. If you have a kneaded eraser, those soft, gummy erasers, mine is on the other side of my table, so I'm going to grab it really quick. If you have one of these, awesome. If you don't have one of these, no big deal. If you have just a regular hard rubber eraser or even the eraser on the back of your pencil, you can use that. But I like to use it just to lighten up my lines a little bit. Anyone who has watched me do a drawing demo before knows that this is kind of my go-to technique because I feel most comfortable with a sketch before I do a painting. Some people feel comfortable just diving right in, but I just like to have those guidelines there. Helps me feel like I know what I'm doing, where things are going. So, you know, I want them there, but I don't want them to be super visible. So I just kind of take my eraser and tap and make it a little lighter. And then if you do have a stronger eraser, one that's more sturdy, I should say, you can erase out some of those straight lines if you want to. So I'm just going to take out some of those extraneous lines. I'm also going to lighten up that vanishing point. You don't need to have a super defined little dot when you have your finished piece because in real life there's no vanishing point dot that we see off in the distance. It's really more just a guide for you when you're doing your drawings so that you can make sure everything is going in the right place. Okay. All right, so pretty simple to start. I'm going to hold this up just because it's hard to see from a distance. Pretty simple to start. We have just a couple lines giving us a guide so that we can know where our colors are going to go. Okay, so we're going to start with the sky. I think we'll kind of work our way down the painting. And what I did here was I left some areas of the paper white because I thought it kind of looked like clouds. I do have some gray clouds in here, and that is because I didn't like where the birds were, and I tried to cover it up with white paint, and it didn't go as planned. So it's a little stormy here. We will not have stormy clouds. We will have nice white fluffy clouds. But another technique for creating clouds is to kind of leave some white of the paper. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I primarily used a wet on dry technique, which just means I used wet paint on dry paper, so I didn't get the paper wet first. So I'm going to take my biggest brush, and for the background of the sky, I use turquoise. So I'm going to keep my palette handy, just keeping it up here. So I have kind of a, I'm going to create a workflow here where I've got my clean water cup, and then I can grab some paint and then wash my paintbrush off, and I kind of have a little pathway. I like to try to think about where my brush is going to go, because sometimes I'm not paying totally close attention, or I'm kind of zoned out, or I'm sort of just focused on painting, and then I lose track of where things are and I mix things up. So that kind of helps with that. But all right, so I've got my dry paper, my wet brush, and I'm just kind of using the side and making some brush strokes across the top. And you can come back in and fill in some areas if you want that part filled in. But I want it to look a little bit like those, are they cirrus clouds? The ones that are kind of long and thin. Can't quite remember. I used to be really good at remembering cloud types. But that's one of those facts that kind of just fell out of my brain. So if anyone knows, feel free to correct me if it is not a cirrus cloud. But you can see how it's creating a cloud-like texture. And if you find that one side has more white on it than the other, just come in from the opposite side so you can get some variety. But using the side of my brush creates more coverage on the paper versus if I was just using the tip of the brush, kind of like I'm starting to do here as I get to the horizon line. I don't cover as much of the paper, so it would take a lot longer. Cirrus is right. Yay, thank you. Yeah, they were always my favorite kind of cloud. They just seem so peaceful. All right. So you can see I actually did a little bit more of this on this version than my other one, but I think it looks nice, and it really does give the impression of a cloud texture like that. All right, so we'll let that dry, and then we'll move on to working on our ocean now. So let's start with, I'm going to kind of approach this a little differently than I did the first time. That's why I like doing paintings like this more than once. And I think it's a good exercise to practice doing something more than once, because sometimes you learn things from the process of doing it that if you were to do it over again, you would change. And I think I want to start with this darker blue and put it in, maybe not in the back, maybe put it more towards the front, and then do lighter in the back. So I want to start with a kind of a lighter bluish green um, for my background. But I do want to use this sort of mixture, and I think I'm going to do the turquoise and permanent lemon yellow for this mixture. So I have to remix that because I did take that off of my palette. So I'm going to add some more turquoise. Yes, turquoise. And every now and again, give it another palette another little wake up with some water. I like this nice bright green. It's not quite neon, but it does have like it's very zesty green, like very energetic, and I do like that. Now for this, I do think I want to get my paper wet first. So I'm going to use wet and wet technique. And I also just want to say hello to everybody who's just joining and everyone who's been here so far. I'm really glad that you're here. And if you do end up following along with the painting and create your own piece, I hope that you'll share it because I really love seeing what you guys make. It's always super exciting to see your versions of things. So yeah, if you do end up doing a painting and following along, you can post it in Art Snacks Mix. It's mix.artsnacks.co. And we do have a watercolor snacks group there. It's open for everybody. So if you're somebody who's been thinking about subscribing, but you're not subscribed, or maybe a former subscriber, you are, of course, welcome to participate, to ask questions, to share your work, all that good stuff. So please do check that out if you haven't already. And Mix is free to join, so you don't need to have you don't need to be a subscriber, and you don't need to have any kind of like credit card or anything to join. Just make an account and post. And speaking of Mix, also you can find more tutorials and different lessons on there. Some that I have written and posted in the past, and some that my predecessor, Bree, has posted. She is so amazing, and had a lot of really great content on there. So there's tons of stuff from our catalog of material and content that you can spend some time going through. So if you want to kind of just get some practice, or even just read through some things, it's a great opportunity and resource for you guys. All right. So I know I was chatting while I was doing that, but hopefully you can see how by getting the paper wet first, totally different reaction to the paint on the paper than we had with the sky, because the paper was already wet. It was kind of primed to absorb the paint into the paper evenly and spread out. So we have a bit more of a flat, smoother wash on this side than we did at the top. So again, it's not like a right or wrong way to do it. It's just you get different effects by using different approaches to how you put the paint on the paper and how you have the water on the paper first. All right, so while that side is drying, I'm going to kind of jump over to the opposite side so that this has plenty of time to dry as I move in towards the middle. So I used yellow ochre on this outer part. So I'm going to grab some more yellow ochre and add it to my palette. And the thing with watercolors is you want to work in layers. So when I go in and add certain effects, like in my final version, like I have some little speckles for the sand and some variation in the waves, you want to let those layers build up, because the cool thing about watercolors is that they're, for the most part, not all of them, for the most part, they're transparent. So you see the layer underneath show through the layer that you put on top. So you can create some really interesting effects by building up those layers and allowing them to show through. So what I'm doing now is taking my yellow ochre and lining against that wavy line. I'm using wet and dry, so my paper is dry underneath. And I'm getting a nice kind of, not super dark, but pretty saturated layer. That. And I'm going to kind of fan it out just a little bit. And a technique that I like to do is to put kind of a, like I said, heavy, kind of saturated layer down. And then I'll take my brush with clean water and I will pull that color and spread it out so that we get kind of like a gradient effect. Because with watercolor, even if it's mostly dry, but definitely before it's dry, you can reactivate the paint on the paper and you can continue to manipulate it. So sometimes if you're working in too many layers, that's how, if you've ever worked with watercolors and things have started to get muddy, because the colors underneath can start to lift up and they get reactivated. Even if they're absorbed into the fiber of the paper, they can still reactivate when you put a wet brush on top of them. But part of why I'm doing this technique, and I didn't do it with the first one, but I think it works nicely, is because it's going to be darker here. So I feel like it makes sense that this is that line where the wet sand meets the dry sand. So it's a little darker. And if you remember what I was saying about atmospheric perspective, I'm actually going to lighten up this a little bit and let it gradually get a little darker in the front. And with that said, I'll add a little more to the front here. Just move this up just a little so you can see closer to the bottom where I'm working. Okay. Okay. Well, something kind of like that. So got a nice gradient of color going on over here versus this smoother color over there. All right, so now I think I'm going to move on towards this middle part. And this was where I was thinking I might want to go a little darker than I did originally. So I'm going to take, this is, what mixture was this? I think this is, oh, this is my indigo. I think I'm going to do the turquoise and Indian yellow this time. Did I do? No, I'm going to do indigo and Indian yellow. See, that's why it's so helpful to have this key here, because I can really think about what colors do I want to use, where do I want to go next, and what do I need to create the mixture. So it's nice to have that there. Gives you an opportunity to pause and think about the colors that you want. Oh no! I accidentally used my clean water cup. It's okay. It's not too much. my own workflow. I was just talking about how I create a workflow, and I didn't even pay attention to it. Okay, so I made this a little cooler, but I do want to thin it out a little with some water. I don't want it to be quite so dark. So I'll add some water to that. This is where a pipette can be helpful too, if you don't want to accidentally get paint in your clean water cup. If you want to make it a little lighter. Okay, doing this one. This is the one. So I'm putting down a flat layer of color first, and then I'll go in and add my variations afterward. So I'll add, some waves and some texture, but I want to get that base layer down because, like I was saying, watercolor is transparent. So, that layer is going to show through, and I don't want the white of the paper showing through. I'd rather have a color underneath. Okay. So now while that's drying, and I'm kind of working like with my areas spaced out because that way they can dry without the colors bleeding into each other. So I kind of purposefully am jumping around in different layers for that. So now I can show you adding in some texture and variety. So I'm going to take a little bit of actually the same dark green mixture. And if you got a chance to look on Mix, I did a little tutorial about how to paint waves. So I do go more into depth about how you can create a wave texture, but I'll show you just quickly a way that you can create a nice sort of wave shape is taking your brush. This is a round brush, so it has a nice point and then flares out into a wider edge. If you press down with the point first and then allow the brush to flatten and then come back up to a point, you get this kind of like flat and pointy shape at the same time. And you can, kind of give it a little wave shape like that. You can practice creating these kinds of organic, wavy types of shapes. And it doesn't always have to be this type of like extreme pointy to extreme flat type of shape, but getting that sort of motion can help you to practice getting a wave shape overall. So that's the brush technique I'm going to use for this background part. And I want to use a darker color because, like I was saying, the way light passes through water, sometimes you will see the sunlight coming through the clear water. Other times it's going to be more in shadow. So just adding a little bit of the variety. And actually, I should have been paying a little closer attention. You want to follow along with your lines because these will also be going back towards your finishing point. So these are a little too flat, but that's okay. Not the end of the world. And it's okay if it gets a little thin or light because this is in the background, so it doesn't need to be super defined. And we can also take our same color that we used to create the flat wash and add a little bit of that too. And they can overlap. And you can add water. Oh, you missed the color I'm using for the waves. Good question. So I'm using my two mixtures. This is turquoise and permanent lemon yellow. So that's what I'm using right now. And then this was the other mixture I used. This is indigo and Indian yellow to create this sort of like darker green. And then I've kind of added a little more water to these to thin them out. So they're a little lighter than my initial mixture of them. So I hope that helps. Good question. And then you can do the same thing we did with the sand back here and take a little bit of your water. And if you want to just soften some of your waves, just take a little bit of clear water with your brush and you can kind of erase out a little bit the shape or blend colors together a little more if you feel like they're too defined, like if the shape is not fading into the other shapes like you want, or if you want just something to be lighter, or if you accidentally have an area that's puddling, like it's pooling and getting too dark, just use a wet brush with a little clear water, and that's a good trick for erasing. So that's what I'm doing now, just taking my brush and softening out some edges and lightening some things. So another trick with watercolor paints is that usually you want to preserve your lighter values, so those lighter parts. So I started with that light green in the background, and now I'm adding my darker colors on top. So it does take a little bit of planning in advance when you do a watercolor painting, because you want to kind of think about where you want your highlights to be. Because even though you can do this technique where you're going in and lightening up areas, it can be difficult to make things lighter, because unlike other paints that are opaque, meaning they cover up the paper more, they're not transparent, it's hard to add light stuff on top because the colors just keep building and just keep getting darker. So you have to kind of think about it and pay attention a little bit more closely than you normally would with other media. Okay, so you've got some nice variety. I was a little more structured with my waves this time. Last time I just kind of blotted the paint into the shapes, but I kind of like it's like a little stylized almost. I like that it's not quite as loose, but you can also kind of be a little more loose and just kind of blot the color in too. You'll find techniques that you like that as you play around and practice different brush techniques, you might like better than the ones that I've shown you. And that's totally okay too. A big part of just playing around is finding things that work well for you. So yeah, you can try it my way, or you can try a whole new way that you might like better. Okay, so I think I'm going to go back to this mixture. I'm going to mix up a little more. So this was the color I was using. That is a mix of turquoise and the permanent lemon yellow. I had to mix up more of the color, but I actually want to water this down. So another trick with watercolor is that when you want to lighten a color, you don't add white to it. You just add more water, because the white in your painting is the paper underneath. So again, the paints being transparent, that comes into play when you are incorporating the weight of the paper. Thinking about how you lighten your colors means that you just add more water so that more of the weight of the paper shows through. I was trying to talk and think at the same time. didn't go so well. So I'm just adding a really watered down mixture of the same colors in the background, although it does seem a little more yellow. Let me add a touch more turquoise just to cool it down a little. Okay, that's better. It's a little too yellow. Something I really like about these Van Gogh paints is just the way they apply onto the paper. They're super vibrant, which I think is really nice. I was excited to see this palette when we were looking at what to include in the box, because this is a good palette for mixing. It has a nice collection of pretty classic colors that you can mix together, particularly Payne's Gray, Burnt Sienna, and Yellow Ochre. Those are three really good colors to mix with, at least when I learned painting when I was in school. So I think it's a nice variety of colors that you can work with. I also am excited that there's the Chinese white paint in here. I think that's really nice. And we're going to use it in this painting, which is going to be really fun. Okay, so I'm going to come back to actually. Well, no, I'll work on this part next because I think that will work. So that then I'll let these dry, and then we'll come over to this part. So this one is, let me count my beach, sand, waves. Okay, do I have an extra one? Maybe I have an extra one. That's okay. I'm gonna, I think, use this same kind of light color because this is supposed to be the crest of a wave. So I'm just gonna fill that in with the same exact mixture. Okay. All right. And then, let's see. I think I will come over to this part now. So this part is the mixture of yellow ochre and burnt sienna. So I'm just going to add some more paint in here. And I'm going to use wet and dry technique on this one too. Because I'm thinking if I have some sort of the same technique here, it's just going to look kind of sandy. I have a little bit of a rough texture. And I'm going to try to keep the atmospheric perspective in mind also. So I'm going to lighten up the back over here. And I'm going to make it a little darker in the front by adding a tiny bit more burnt sienna. This does look a little streaky, but I'm not too worried about it because I'm going to go over and added texture effect on top. So if yours is turning out that way too, it's okay. We're going to cover it up. But I am going to lighten up the back over here. So if this happens to you when you're doing a painting, if you ever make something a little too dark and you want to lighten it up, again, technique I showed you before with the clean brush, but this time if you just take a paper towel, you can kind of erase out and then take your brush and just blend the colors back out like that. And I use a little bit of like a scrubby sort of brush motion, little circles, like you're brushing your teeth, but you know, you're brushing your painting. And then that kind of helps it blend together without being super streaky. You might need to add a little more paint. You can even start to add some little sand dots in there if you want. But that's kind of how you go in and erase things out. And you can also sort of get a feathering effect or fade your colors into each other. So that's just a technique that you can use. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this sort of crest area. And again, I'm going to use, oh my goodness, sorry guys. I'm going to use this watered down mixture and just kind of use a loose, this time I'm going to use more of like a loose brush stroke than as much of a structured one as before, just to kind of show you another way that you can do it. So this is another way. And then while that's still wet, you can take another color. This is the same two mixtures I was using before, and you can kind of let them blend into each other. This is another way that you can get kind of a watery, wavy effect. Just leaving some areas that are still light, like it's where the light is hitting, like a reflection. This is a little more of the technique I used in the example painting, just kind of letting the colors flow together. It's a little lighter and more brushy. And again, just following along those orthogonal lines, making sure it's always coming back to that vanishing point. Okay, and I'm going to do this. Now this is this darker mixture I have over here. This is also my initial mix of indigo and Indian yellow. It just has more indigo in it, I think. So it's a little tiny bit darker on there. I'm going to go in and just add some dark shadows. It's actually a little too dark. Now you can go in if you want to add more variation in the water. You're certainly welcome to do so. You can add as many layers as you like, although don't add too many because you don't want to overwork your painting. Just going in and adding some variations of color, light and dark. I'm going to let this dry a little bit, and just for the sake of time, I'm going to jump over and show you the technique for creating sand texture. And then we'll add a little bit of the foam on the waves, and then we'll kind of wrap up from there. So for the sand technique, what I did was took a little bit of the yellow ochre on here. And you can continue using this brush, but if you want to switch it up to a smaller brush, you can do that. But what I did was just took some of the yellow ochre, went in and added some dots. And anyone who has watched me do a demo before, I've always said, don't use your finger in your painting, but I'm gonna do it. I did where I just kind of picked it up with my finger and then spread out the dots a little bit like that. And that created that sort of sandy technique. So that's what I say about breaking rules in art. I break my own rules all the time. That's what they're there for, so that you can break them. So feel free to try this technique too. But it kind of helps to soften your little stippled dots, but it also kind of adds more because the paint is on your fingers, so it works a little bit like a stamp. And just in terms of your water to paint ratio, you don't want this to be too watery because it's just going to make a mess, especially if you try to use your finger. But you also don't want it to be too thick. You don't want the paint to be too thick. So you want to kind of have enough that you can move the paint around on the palette and it goes onto the paper smoothly, but not so watery that you're getting big puddles of water all over your painting. And you can think about, like I was talking about with atmospheric perspective on this too, you can go in and add a little bit of burnt sienna. And if you feel like your burnt sienna is too orange and you want to cool it down a little bit, because it looks more orange, even though it's kind of like an orangey brown, it looks more orange next to blue because orange and blue are complements. So in the context of being around so much blue, it's going to push it to look more orange. So if you're like, oh man, this is so orange, I don't know if I like it as much, and you want it to be a little more brown, take a little bit of blue and just mix a tiny bit of blue into it, and it's going to start to neutralize your orange so that it is a little more of like a brown, like a neutral brown color. So that's a trick. If you have a color that is going too far in one direction, like it's too orange or too blue or something, add its complement. So, for instance, you would add purple to yellow, yellow to purple, red to green, green to red. Adding a complement to a color is going to neutralize it and make it less saturated and less intense. So that's just a tip for you as you are practicing mixing colors. And I do think I actually like it with the blue a little bit. So for the future, I think I'll tone down that burnt sienna, especially if I'm using a lot of blue in a painting. Color is definitely magic. I love mixing colors and making discoveries and just seeing how they react with each other. It's pretty exciting. So we're getting close to our time to wrap up. So I just want to show you a couple of finishing touches, but please don't feel like you need to rush through finishing your piece. Continue to add more waves, play with techniques. If you want to try to soften things up a little more, you can do that. But I'm going to show you how to use the white paint. The white paint is special. It's different than the other paints because it is opaque, which means it's going to cover up the paper. Although it doesn't totally cover it up like an acrylic paint or gouache paint would. And it will pick up some of the colors underneath. So just be mindful of that. But it's great for a scene like this where you can go in and add some highlights or details fun things like the foam of the water on the beach, on the waves as they are, crashing against the sand, which is really great. But what I'm just doing is I'm kind of dabbing the paint on using, again, kind of circular motions. And that's going to make it look cloudy, like cloud shaped, I mean. And that's going to create a foamy looking kind of texture. And I'm going to continue that on all of these waves where my dividing lines are, because that's kind of where the waves are breaking and crashing against each other. So you can continue that on all of those. And then you can also go in and add some little highlights, just some dots. I usually will do little plus signs to kind of make that look like a sparkle. Because when the sun is hitting the ocean waves and it's glittering off of the surface of the water, that's such a pretty effect. And this is a great way to capture something like that. So you can continue that throughout your waves. I also added some more clouds in the sky. So you can go in and do the same sort of thing, except I'm just using more of the brush to pat the color down onto the paper. Well, lack of color, I should say, because it's white, but you get that kind of cloudy effect. You can also use the same technique where you get some clean water and just soften out your edges, and then you can get sort of like a dreamy, soft cloud effect. And the last thing I'll show you before we start to wrap up is I'm going to take my small brush, or a smaller brush, a little bit of Payne's Gray, and I'm going to add some birds into the background. And all I do for birds is just create sort of a V shape. So come out and dip down and do the same thing on the other side. And get some variety in the size. So the birds that are smaller will look further away. The birds that are bigger will look closer. So you can think about where the birds would be flying in a flock, what direction you want them to go. They don't have to follow the orthogonal lines. They can go wherever they want. They're free. They're birds. But yeah, so in general, this is a fun approach to painting a beach scene. Oh yeah, and I see a comment in here about using the white to soften the clouds. Yeah, it's really fun. And again, it's going to kind of pick up that blue in the background, and I'll show you up close. You can see it a little better, but it starts to create like almost shadows where it picks up the blue and it creates a little bit of depth, which is nice too. But yeah, so essentially takeaways from this perspective drawing, use a vanishing point to create 1-point perspective. It's going to create an overall sense of depth. Using a wide variety of value, light and dark, in mixing your colors is going to also help to give depth. Thinking about atmospheric perspective, so things get lighter the further away they are, darker the closer that they are, sharper the closer they are, more fuzzy and less detailed the further away they are. It's another key. And also just practicing mixing your colors as an exercise and warm up before you jump into your painting. It's really helpful if you want to work with a really particular palette, if you just want to experiment with what happens when you mix colors together. It's a great way to swatch out your colors, but it's also a great reference tool for yourself if you want to, remember what colors you use to get a certain outcome. So I hope that everybody had a lot of fun working on this painting today. I found it really relaxing and peaceful to be thinking about the beach and painting a beach scene. And I'm excited to see what you guys were working on. I really hope that you'll share your artwork. If you want to share it on Art Snacks Mix, please post it there. If you're more of an Instagram user, post it on Instagram and tag us at WatercolorSnacks You can also use the hashtag WatercolorSnacks. I'll be happy to take a look at that. And I usually like to try to reshare stuff to our stories so that people can enjoy your work as well. So thank you all so much. And I'll see you guys around. I'll see you on Mix. So have a good night, guys. Thank you.